Welcome to our next video on student active participation. This is perhaps the most important part of BIC, Building Instructional Coherence, because this is the part where the students actually do the work and get the learning. When we talked about academic learning time, we mentioned that it's very important that students know and understand the objective, they actively manipulate the content, and while they're manipulating that content, that they are successful at a 75 to 95% rate. Well, student active participation is when we do that active manipulation of the content and where we want to be teaching students in their zone of proximal development so that they can be successful. So let's look at our core instructional model and see where student active participation falls. As you can see, this is the most important part of our instructional model and takes up nearly half the time that we will be teaching. This is when students actually do the work. This is the to and the you that we see on our lesson planning template. When we looked at that gradual release model, we talked about the me, the we, the to, and the you as a dance instructor. Me, watch me do it. Now we, do it with me. This is the part where the students start taking over that gradual release of responsibility. First, we have them working with a partner, and then once we know that they are going to be successful, they go on to do the work independently. Let's look at our thinking frames to see the questions that we could ask ourselves when we're planning for student active participation. I'm going to give you a moment to read these questions on the screen. I'm going to point out a few of these that I want you to notice. Right now, I want you to notice that we want our students involved in active listening and active speaking. And for that, we want them paired. So let's take a moment to talk about why this is so important and how we can make it happen. Partnering is a really important part of the strategies that we want to tuck away in our teacher repertoire. The reason we want our students involved in partnering is that often we ask questions and the same 5 or 6 students are the ones who are willing to raise their hands and answer our questions. In every class, across every school year, we know this is true. We end up calling on the same students over and over. What partnering does is it gives those students who are willing to talk and who need to talk, those extroverted students, it gives them that talk time, but they get to direct it just at one student. They don't get to, dominate the conversation for everyone in the class, but they still get the opportunity to answer. Then you have some students in your class who are more introverted, who need a little think time before they are ready to answer, and who frankly don't really want to raise their hand and answer in front of the whole class. However, just because a student is more introverted doesn't mean that they should be allowed to not engage or not be held accountable to answer our questions. So partnering gives the introverted students some think time, and then it also allows them to just share with one other student in a way that feels safe and comfortable for them. In this way, we increase student engagement across the board. We increase accountability because now, instead of just a few students answering the questions that we ask, everybody in the class has to answer the questions. And when we do this, we get better quality responses. When students actually have time to discuss their thoughts with another student, they are probably more willing to answer the question in the whole class. So that a student who normally wouldn't raise their hand When we say, okay, let's wrap up these partnering conversations, tell me what you and your partner talked about. That more hesitant student is now more confident and willing to raise their hand and answer because they've had a chance to bounce those ideas off another student. Partnering is such a vital teaching tool that we can use to just really change the conversations that we're having in our class. So I encourage partnering across the board. It's a real game changer in my opinion, and it's really a vital part of student active participation. Now, going back into our thinking frames, what I want you to notice now is the word active. We have active showing up a lot, and paired, independent work, manipulating the content. So what does it look like to have our students actively engaged in manipulating the content? Well, this is their time of thinking and learning. Active manipulation can be reading about the subject matter. It can be talking with a partner about the subject matter. It can be doing some experiments about the subject matter. But across the board, no matter what kind of active manipulation our students are doing, what we want them doing in every circumstance is thinking. So what does it look like to think in all of our different content areas? We want to be able to teach our students that there are lots of ways to think. And yes, these are going to bleed over into different content areas, but there are also some thought processes that are specific to the various disciplines. For example, when you are thinking like a mathematician, you're looking for patterns, you're making estimations, you're forming generalizations, you're constructing an argument. Now, you can look at those bullet points and think, wow, learning those skills will come in handy in a lot of different subject matters. Absolutely. They're being reinforced through our math instruction, and students are learning to think and interact like a mathematician. How about in social studies and history? Well, we're going to learn to consider different perspectives, to look at events from different sides. We're going to learn to reason and go back into the text and cite evidence for our conclusions and build explanations. Again, this is going to be beneficial in so many different areas. And using history as our tool, our students can learn to think and manipulate the content like a historian. How about a scientist? Think like a scientist. Well, a scientist needs to be able to make and test hypotheses, to observe closely, build explanations for the things that they are discovering. How about thinking like a reader? In ELA, we're going to learn to make interpretations, make connections, text to self, text to text, etc. Make predictions about what we think might happen and the cause and effects of what's going on. All of these bleed over into each other, but our different disciplines can help our students to actively manipulate the content, digging down deep into that content so that they can think in the different ways that these readers, these thinkers, these students need to. So how does disciplinary thinking aid our students' understanding? I have 8 ways listed here on the screen, so I'm going to give you a moment to read through those and see how these different kinds of thinking helps our students to grow. As you glance down through that list, I'm sure that you can see lots of opportunities for your students to grow in ways that you want them to while you have them in your class. All of these make up the different ways that our students are actively manipulating the content, no matter what our particular areas of discipline or particular areas of teaching are. We want our students identifying patterns, making generalizations, going back into the text to find evidence that would back up their arguments, find their claims, find their assumptions, identifying bias. These are things that are going to help our students, and as they dig down deep into our content, these are things that are going to be growing in them. Let's go back into our thinking frame, and I now want you to think about, from a teacher's perspective, how do we know that our students are going to meet the lesson objective, and how are we going to differentiate? When we talked earlier about activating relevant knowledge, we referenced using the Bloom's words to create our objectives. We can also use those Bloom's words to help our students dig down deep. We know we want to go for the top of this pyramid, applying, analyzing, evaluating, and creating. But we also know that remembering and understanding are essential. This is the bottom of the pyramid. It's what keeps it stable. So let's take a look at what that might look like to have an assignment that touched on all of these different areas. So let's start with the first level, remembering, recalling, or recognition of specific information. What might it look like in my classroom to create an activity that would allow my students to manipulate the content? Well, an example of remembering in, again, 8th grade social studies would be list the original 13 colonies of the United States. Now, sometimes we say, oh, remembering, understanding, those are low level. Yep, they are, and it's just listing. However, I need to be able to identify those colonies before I can go on and do the things that are higher up on the Bloom's taxonomy. So remember, what are those 13 original colonies? How about understanding, explaining ideas or concepts? Well, I might ask my students to summarize the key events that led up to the Revolutionary War. My students are going to have to really do some understanding in order to explain what those key events were and how they all added up to what would become the American Revolution. Next, we have applying, which is where I'm going to use my strategies, my concepts, principles. I'm going to use what I remember, and I'm going to use my understanding. I'm now going to apply it in some new situations. What might that look like? What would a task that I could assign to my students that they could actively manipulate the content, what might that look like? You know, I could have my students compare the causes of the Revolutionary War to some conflicts around the world today. So now they're taking those key events that they identified and are now using them to say, what's changed? Does anything change? Do we still see these kinds of events happening that lead to conflict around the world? Next, analyzing, breaking down information into its different parts. What's a kind of task that I could give my students that would have them analyze as they manipulate the content? Well, I have two different forces at work here leading up to the American Revolution. So I might have them identify what are some of the differences between the Tories and the Patriots in the lead up to the Revolutionary War. And then we have evaluating, judging the value of these ideas, materials, methods, developing and applying standards and criteria. Hey, how could you persuade someone to join either the Patriots or the Tories? What would you say to them to get them to come to the other side? And finally, with creating, developing something new, how would our country be different if the Patriots lost the war, if the British had won the Revolutionary War? So going back to student active participation and recognizing that this is the heart of the core instructional model. This is where the students do the work to get the learning. And remembering that teachers, we are the ones that make a difference in our students' lives and in our classroom. Coming up next is our final video on ISS, Identifying Student Success. Thank you again for your time.